Okay. So Barbara, if you'd like to start.
Sorry, how do I stop the, there's going to be a feedback loop, isn't there? How do I stop that?
You'll need to make sure that you close your browser, the internet. If it's opened up an internet page, close it.
That's closed.
Okay, should be fine.
Okay.
Okay, Barbara, you can.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final Research Forum seminar.
Sorry.
Hello, are you okay, Harvey, there?
Yes, sorry, I can't work out how to. Oh, that's it. Yep.
Okay, so I'm really delighted to welcome Harvey Davis to give this final seminar. And delighted because he's a colleague and he's also in his copious spare time doing a PhD with us too. He's a teaching fellow here in historical performance and a staff pianist. His expertise covers many centuries. Of course, a real interest in early music and music all the way up to the contemporary period. He's a founding member of the Pleyel Ensemble, and he also is part of the Davis duo with his mother. He's an expert on Arnold Cook, and this is what we're going to hear about today, in pre-war Manchester, 1933 to 1938, and he's at an advanced stage of his PhD studies. He has many recordings and he produces many editions, and is a wonderful performer. He was involved in the project music collection of Elizabeth Sykes Edgerton in Tatton Park, and so many other projects. And it's hard to keep up with everything that Harvey does, but I'm absolutely delighted to welcome him to tell us about his current research project.
Thank you, Barbara.
Just before I start, before Harvey starts, we are live streaming on YouTube. So if you don't want to be seen on YouTube, can you blank your screen? Also, put your sound on mute, which I will do in a few seconds, and hopefully we can avoid some looping as we've had in the past. Anyway, over to Harvey now.
Thank you, Barbara. Just bear with me, everybody, while I see if I can share with you my screen. Just give me 2 seconds. Give me a thumbs up if you can see something yet. Good-o. Let's try. How's that? Whoops. Okay. Right, we're possibly ready to go now. Okay, so as Barbara said, a very good afternoon to you, everyone, and I'm going to be talking about Arnold Cook, the English composer Arnold Cook's short time in Manchester during the 1930s. Please forgive me by beginning this little presentation with a minor rant. The fascinating and brilliantly presented paper given a month or so ago by Adam Swain introduced us to a piano concerto by Ferdinand Ries. Despite Ries's well-known connection with a figure as colossal as Beethoven, his music and life remain relatively obscure even today. If one actually does only a little private research into Ries and his music, it quickly becomes obvious that his contribution to musical life was far more than simply being a friend of and amanuensis for Beethoven. Ferdinand Ries was not simply a footnote in Beethoven's life, but an influential musician in his own right. In a similar way, Arnold Cook is still best known as a footnote in the life of his teacher, Paul Hindemith. It is both inappropriate and ultimately meaningless to attempt to make direct comparisons between artists. Rather, it is far more valuable to assess each on his or her own merits. This not only potentially enriches the canon with a far broader spectrum of music by bringing lesser-known repertoire to wider attention, but also provides a more meaningful context for the inevitable and necessary studies of those who are perceived to be the greatest composers. Having spent some 5 years becoming acquainted with Cook's music, in many cases rather intimately, I am quite convinced of the quality and value of much of his output. As with all composers, formative influences are bound to exist in the music. From these, personal preference and taste combine with and enrich what has been absorbed to make something new. As the laws of genetics constantly create the unique from combining the pre-existing, so new voices constantly appear in the world of music with their own unique syntheses of sounds, ideas, and styles. Once again, the study of that which is believed to be in the periphery can surely only lead to greater understanding of the whole. At the start of my project to perform and record much of Arnold Cook's chamber music, there was but scant scholarly information to draw on about the man, his life, and his music. A handful of journal articles, 3 American PhD theses, and a short monograph produced in honour of Cook for his 90th birthday by the British Music Society and written by the conductor Eric Wetherell were all that existed. In addition, copies of most of Cook's music were hard to come by. Any modern editions that could be found were invariably badly produced with numerous errors, and the availability of recordings of even major works, such as the 6 symphonies, was limited. Indeed, the second still awaits a premiere recording. Therefore, I felt that rather than trying to study the works I wanted to record in their own splendid contextual isolations, that it would first be more valuable to piece together what I could of the life which had given rise to these creations. So I embarked on an attempt to fill in the sketchy biographies contained in the few articles and monograph on Cook. It quickly became clear that an important period of Cook's life was his time in Manchester. Perhaps this should be no surprise, as he was recently returned from Berlin and his studies with Hindemith. And apart from a brief tenure as a part-time theatre music director in Cambridge, his appointment as Professor of Harmony and Composition at the Royal Manchester College of Music was his first professional post. He was just 26 years old and, I suspect, dizzy with the new sounds he'd encountered on the continent. Cook had lost the music directorship of the Festival Theatre in Cambridge through no fault of his own in the summer of 1933, and he needed to find regular employment. His former Cambridge professor, E.J. Dent, came to his aid, recommending him to the Royal Manchester College of Music, where a replacement was required for the departing Dr. Alfred W. Wilcox, who had been appointed as the organist of Exeter Cathedral. In a notice of the 16th of September 1933, one of the Manchester Guardian's staff reporters announced the appointment of Arnold Atkinson Cook as the RNCM's newly appointed Professor of Harmony and Composition. As Eric Wetherell says in his monograph, this appointment may well have been seen as a revolutionary step. Not only was Cook young and inexperienced, but as a former student of Hindemith, he would have been bringing some challenging ideas to a city not yet acquainted with much of the musical goings-on of the continent. Michael Kennedy, in his history of the RNCM, describes Cook's appointment as the most progressive for some time and a belated acknowledgement of the new forces abroad in composition. New music was not yet a priority for the city's concert promoters. Shortly after Cook arrived in Manchester, the most daring concert of the holiday season was a programme of Stravinsky's music, conducted by the composer. Oh, to have been there! But even here, the violin concerto, played by Samuel Dushkin, was the most risky work, the others being Feuerwerk, Suite Italienne, the Suite from Firebird, and some other short pieces. Neville Cardus, reviewing the concert for the Manchester Guardian on the 23rd of February 1934, noted, "Too many empty seats," but was hugely enthusiastic, suggesting that the composer return the following season with his Sacre. In the event, it wasn't until the late 1950s that Le Sacre du Printemps was first performed in Manchester. And Cardus wrote, "Though the audience was not by any means small for the visit of the most fearlessly original of contemporary composers, there were too many empty seats. The absentees must somehow be identified, collected together and given a concert all to themselves next season, with a programme made up of The Hymn of Praise, that's Mendelssohn, and The Golden Legend, Arthur Sullivan. Whoever was responsible for this visit of Stravinsky must be warmly congratulated. The great artist brought distinction to the Halle concerts and placed them again, momentarily at least, on the musical map of the period. To say the truth, Stravinsky treated a Manchester audience gently. He gave us none of his most drastic works, such as the unashamed Le Sacre du Printemps. In the following 1934-35 season, Michael Kennedy relates in his history of the Halle Orchestra that the only novelty was the first English performance of Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, with the composer at the keyboard. Again, oh, to have been there. Other risks were short works by Delius, Bax, and none other than our own Arnold Cook. Certainly, Cardus was worried that as the Halle still lacked a principal conductor, Hamilton Harty had jumped before he was pushed in 1933, and nobody had yet been appointed. The constant comings and goings of guest conductors with a single rehearsal before each concert meant that standards were being compromised, and contemporary music could not be safely programmed. True though this undoubtedly was, the conductor Maurice Miles put his finger on it when he said to Donald Brooke, author of Conductor's Gallery more than a decade later, that although the war had brought a new public who were more ready to hear new music than those who had been brought up on Beethoven and Tchaikovsky, there still remained an appalling neglect of our own contemporary composers. This comment suggests that programming such music before the war was yet more risky. Incidentally, Miles was to conduct the first concert performance of Cook's First Symphony with the Yorkshire Symphony Orchestra in 1950. However, the Royal Manchester College of Music, although heavily linked with the Halle Orchestra in terms of its staff and governance, was in a different position. The college did not have to worry about the importance of crowd-pleasing programmes simply to stay afloat. And with a younger generation as its public face, students, there was far more exploration of modern music. The enthusiastic proponents of new music at the Old College included the pianists Lucy Pearce, Dora Gilson, John Wills, John Brennan, and Neil Barkler, and the violinist, later violist, Keith Cummings. All 6 of these were to remain associated with Cook long after he had left Manchester for London, particularly Miss Lucy Pearce, of whom more later. So, one of the most important purveyors of new music, the Manchester Contemporary Music Centre. Established in late 1924 or early 25, following a newspaper comment suggesting the need for it in Manchester, the centre was a branch of the British Music Society's London Contemporary Music Centre. In 1925, more of the Society's subscriptions were devolved to the Manchester branch, enabling rather more regular concerts and therefore the hope and likelihood of more Manchester subscribers. The concerts were usually held in the Memorial Hall on Albert Square, so I'm just waving my mouse if you can see it at the part of the building where it was. It's now a wedding venue and restaurant. The hall is in that corner of the building in the slide. And the Manchester School of Music next door is absolutely nothing to do with today's presentation. It was, in fact, a private business, although with a proprietor who was rather interested in contemporary music, coincidentally. In 1925, Samuel Langford, writing in the Manchester Guardian, said, in possibly one of the longest sentences in the English language, that English music has been for some years, one might say hundreds of years, condemned and ignored on the continent. It is not quite so much ignored today, and the difference has chiefly been brought about by the establishment of the contemporary music centres in England and on the continent, which, unstable as their organisation may be, are attempting something not done before, and something which, if it can be kept in being, must tend to the wider knowledge of English music in countries other than our own. For this reason, one must regret the apathy towards the movement that is shown so far in Manchester, and trust that, for very shame's sake, Manchester music lovers will soon turn more kindly to the movement. A Manchester centre of a representative kind is essential to the movement, and musicians and music lovers should not lightly keep aloof from it. The Manchester Guardian provides crucial commentary on the centre's activities from the 1920s onwards, and just before Cook's arrival in Manchester, we turn again to the paper to discover if the words of 6 years earlier have been heeded. Granville Archer writes that at the Contemporary Music Centre's concert on the 5th of July 1932, there was an enthusiastic audience consisting of probably all the people in Manchester who are interested in modern music, say about 30. The programme, incidentally, consisted of Bartók, Bloch, Bax and Respighi, so perhaps we are beginning to understand why Cook's appointment might have been seen as progressive. His job was confined to teaching the rudiments of music, essentially harmony and counterpoint, to vocal and instrumental students. Cook wrote in a letter to the American clarinetist Stanley Gaulk, dated the 12th of October 1971, that later on he did have one or two composition students as well. Later in the same letter, he wrote that he had actually regarded the Manchester post as only temporary, hoping to settle in London, which he felt was the best centre for music. By 1938, he'd decided that the time had indeed come to make that move, as he wanted to devote himself to composition, and attempt to secure a similar position at one of the London colleges. Of course, in the event, the Second World War intervened, and it would be 1947 before Cook was again teaching at a conservatoire. The first evidence of his compositional activities comes within a few months of Cook's arrival in Manchester. He'd completed an orchestral overture for submitting as his entry for a composition competition arranged by the Daily Telegraph. What enlightened times, or perhaps that should be telegraphs. It's difficult to imagine such a thing today, but the competition prompted no fewer than 223 entries. There were just 3 prizes awarded, with first prize going to Cyril Scott and second to Frank Tapp, 23 years Cook's senior and a composer of so-called light music. Cook was awarded the third prize for his concert overture No. 1, for which he received the princely sum of £50, actually quite a lot of money, and a performance at the Promenade concerts. The first performance took place, however, in Manchester, in the hall of the RNCM, on the afternoon of the 17th of May 1934. The Halle was conducted by the principal of the RNCM, R.J. Forbes, and there are a couple of reports of the concert. The first is again from the Manchester Guardian, where its critic, Granville Hill, describes Mr. Cook's music as well in the fashion. And Hindemith himself has not written anything more percussive than this overture, or more free from anything that could be termed romantic or emotional. There are here no qualities to bring a blush to the cheek of the young modernist. In 2 or 3 sections of music, the chop-chop of the strings and the rhythmic patter of the woodwind give place to a more lyrical style. But soon the percussive element reasserts itself, and the work ends with a defiant flourish. Occasionally, the composer directs our attention to the opening of a fresh passage or section by halting for a moment on a dissonance in the brass. Woodwind and brass, rather than strings, provide the foundation tone. It is all bright, perky, and energetic. Not particularly original, but healthy and exhilarating music that keeps its course and holds itself jauntily. In such a small place as the concert hall in the Manchester College of Music, the Halle ensemble sounded rather overpowering at times, and the strident tones of horns and trumpets, though necessary for Mr. Cook's overture, did not show the players at their best. The new music was heard twice, at the beginning and at the end of the concert. The composer Douglas Steele, then a student at the college, was also present and described the work in a letter to his friend Martin Picken, saying, "The overture came well up to expectations, and most of it bears the indelible stamp of Hindemith and the Walton Brigade, in which the contrapuntal element is, I think, over-prominent. So much so that it reminds me of a kitten going round and round chasing its tail. But it was brisk and bracing and contained 1 or 2 highly suggestive jokes in the brass department, which were good to hear. I believe I noticed Professor Dent in the hall. Cook studied with him, and as Dent is at present chairman of the International Society for Contemporary Music, This will mean that the overture will get a hearing at the next festival. I certainly think it's worth it. In fact, the work did not receive a performance at the next RNCM festival, but it was given by the BBC Symphony Orchestra and Sir Henry Wood at a promenade concert in the Queen's Hall on the 30th of August that year, and again by the Halle with Forbes on the 8th of November 1934. A 21-year-old Benjamin Britten was at the prom performance and describes the work in his diary as exhilarating and certainly up to date. It was an early break for Cook and a good way to make his mark in Manchester. It was and still is quite something for a young composer to get a new orchestral work heard 3 times, played by 2 professional orchestras. But I think that Cook was struggling with the music that he was composing. Essentially, I'm not convinced that he was comfortable with where he was taking himself musically. And although he was technically perfectly able to compose complex counterpoint, I perceive a feeling of slight emotional detachment in the music that simply wasn't within his real character. Perhaps the evidence for this comes partly from the fact that he only managed to complete 3 works over the next couple of years, a duo for violin and viola, 3 short pieces and a quartet for flute and strings. This slide shows the relevant extract from my own complete catalogue of the works of Cook. I'm sure that Cook will have been one of the regular attendees at the Contemporary Music Centre's concerts in the Memorial Hall in Albert Square, and there he would have heard some of the new music by his teacher Hindemith. We know that early performances of Hindemith's Sonata for Flute and Piano and the E major Sonata for Violin and Piano were given at these concerts, and both works are representative of the lyrical style to which Hindemith himself had turned in the 1930s. I think that for Cook, hearing this music probably came as something of a relief to him. I suspect that he felt that it had given him some sort of permission to compose in this more traditional style, with its use of classical forms and instrumentations, yet with an updated take on tonal harmony. There can be no doubt that Cook was in fact enthralled to the overwhelming genius of Hindemith. However his teacher's music was received at the time, and however it is received now, the fact remains that Hindemith had developed a highly original voice, instantly recognizable and of significant influence on many composers, perhaps particularly those from the USA where he later taught. We know from his students' testimony that Hindemith was an almost Mendelssohnian fluency as a composer, something that often left his composition students utterly overawed and always impressed, as he improved and rewrote pieces that they had composed for his classes. But Hindemith's vital legacy to his students, whatever their styles became, was a deep knowledge of the craft of composition, the unshakable belief that composition without structure is about as effective as a car without wheels. Whatever the truth of the matter, by late 1936, Cook's music was becoming less dissonant, less abrasive, and less reliant on pure counterpoint for its textural and formal interest. And that was mostly the way it remained for the next half-century or so. After the success of the Concert Overture No. 1, Cook's next was his String Quartet No. 1, a work, however, that had been composed earlier in 1933 in Cambridge. It was taken up by the Grilla Quartet, one of the foremost English quartets of the period, and they gave it its premiere on the 13th of March 1935 at the Contemporary Music Centre, and they played it on at least 3 more occasions, also giving the first broadcast in 1936. Neville Cardus, reviewing it for the Manchester Guardian, seemed to find it a more challenging piece than the Grillas, and although it's quite long, I really think it's worth hearing some of his criticism printed in the newspaper the next day. The concert in the Memorial Hall last night at the Manchester Contemporary Music Centre was a severely penitential affair, but compensation will surely come to those who attended, the whole 40 of them. After wearing the hair shirt of Arnold Cook's quartet, we shall be free to wallow for a while at least in the awful sensuousness, the lilies and langurs of Schoenberg and Anton von Webern. Mr. Cook was, I believe, a pupil of Hindemith. How pityingly he must look upon his master's lullabies. For Mr. Cook is aggressive in his modernity, He most skillfully and assiduously avoids anything resembling a melody. He knows how to make his texture as unbeautiful as a ball of string after a kitten has finished with it. He glories in the contemporary delight of making a fiddle into an instrument of flagellation. It goes on for some time longer. One wonders how much this must have stung, and just how much a part it played in Cook's entirely conscious decision to sweeten his music. Further evidence for Cook's likely attendance at the CMCM's concerts comes in the context of his sonata for two pianos, begun in 1936 and the subject of my recent paper for the RNCM's postgraduate conference. In later years, Cook admitted that he had just heard Stravinsky's Concerto for two pianos, a work for two unaccompanied pianos, and that he felt that it had influenced him to some extent. Stravinsky's Concerto was given by Lucy Pearce and John Brennan at the CMCM concert on the 20th of November 1936, and the aforementioned Hindemith violin sonata was played by Leonard Hirsch and Pearce. Both works had been given their UK premieres at the London branches by different performers a month earlier, and it may be that Cook heard both concerts. The London performance of the Stravinsky had been given by Adolf Hallis and Franz Reitzenstein, for whom Cook wrote his own two-piano sonata, and we know from the composer himself that he had received the invitation to write that work after the summer of 1936, so exactly at the time of the London Contemporary Music Concert. It didn't take Cook too long to write this two-piano sonata, and Hallis and Reitzenstein played it on the 15th of March 1937, 6 months after the invitation had been received to write it at the Wigmore Hall. It's reasonable to assume that Cook was there, and later in the year, the 29th of November to be precise, it was played in Manchester for the first time at the CMC concert by Lucy Pearce and John Brennan. The remaining work from the period, the Quartet for Flute and Strings, was completed in 1935, and it doesn't seem to have been played at a CMC concert in Manchester. But it was given its first performance at the College of Music by its dedicatee, Ernst Brunner, with 3 RNCM students in the College Hall in 1936. Precise date I yet have to discover. Brunner was a gifted amateur flautist whose family owned the highly successful chemical business that merged with 2 other firms to form ICI in 1926. A London performance at the Cowdray Hall given by the flautist John Francis followed in April 1937, and it was reviewed in The Observer, where its cleanliness and masserie are described as admirable. Britten's Holiday Diary for piano, which was premiered at the same concert, fares rather less well in the same review. Other of Cook's activities are really very difficult to trace during this period, and I have not yet managed to find out even where he was living in Manchester. However, I do know that Cook directed the University Settlement Players Orchestra in productions of Purcell's The Fairy Queen in May 1935, and The Beggar's Opera in June 1936. Both were performed at the Roundhouse in Ancoats. On each occasion, the orchestra was made up principally of RNCM students. So, thank you for listening, and as yet that is about all I know of Arnold Cook's sojourn in this city. But I can report that in the minutes of the RNCM council meeting just after Cook had left for London in 1938, Richard Hall is announced as his successor, and Cook is described as, and I quote, a very popular figure in the college, and his departure is greatly regretted by his students and his colleagues. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Harvey. Really fascinating, and it certainly adds to the sort of expertise we have at the RNCM in looking at Manchester musical life, and ranging from the 19th century and well into the 20th. Really interesting for me on all sorts of reasons, because I've been working a bit on the London Contemporary Music Centre, and I've been interested in the Manchester end of things. But let's see, we're about to open up for questions. I could chat to you for a while, but if you would like to ask a question, could you put your put the blue hand up to indicate you'd like to ask a question, and I will try and take them in order. It's also fine to look at to put things in the chat, and I'll do my best with that. And if Harvey, you keep half an eye on the chat too, and we can see whether we can answer various questions. And maybe as you're all thinking of the things you want to ask, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the contemporary music centres started in London, but the Manchester one was really important. So it seemed to start in 1921 as part of a post-World War I initiative to promote the music of the particular country, so in British music, but also with an eye to what's happening on the continent. So did the Manchester one, was there a very distinctive character to it? Was its repertoire different? Was the balance between regional, national and international repertoire? How did that differ perhaps from its London counterpart?
I think in general, from what I've been reading and from what I've discovered, that in Manchester, as I was alluding to at the sort of beginning of this, they were really still quite conservative here, both in terms of audiences, and I suspect also the promoters themselves, not just because of the audiences, but just from their own particular tastes, as far as I've been reading. Neville Cardus and Archer Hill, Granville Hill, writing in the Guardian, always want to encourage more, shall we say, daring programming at the Contemporary Music Centre's concerts. But in fact, it seems that during the 20s and certainly the early 30s, that actually, and indeed well into the probably even the late 30s, that their programming was pretty conservative and not even contemporary, quite literally. I mean, some pieces that were programmed were as old as 15 years old, so hardly contemporary really, and Cardus complains quite a bit about that.
Okay, because I mean, what's really striking, having looked at the World War I repertoire that was coming from, certainly from the Halle, is that Stravinsky's very much in evidence during the war. And just after. I'm sure that Jeff will have things to say on that too. So hearing that in the 1930s, it was perhaps a surprising thing to have a Stravinsky program, and that Rite of Spring wasn't heard to the 1950s is remarkable, really, because yes, it does feel more experimental in that earlier period.
I think you know, in terms of the Stravinsky, he'd obviously been sort of, well, it looks as though he'd been warned not to be too harsh with the Manchester folk. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, looking at the reviews from of the period about Stravinsky's music in other concerts, the reviews in the Manchester Guardian suggest that both composers such as Stravinsky and indeed Hindemith were not living up to their early reputations as sort of enfant terrible, if you like, of contemporary music. And I mean, Cardus, for one, I think it is, who writes that he thinks by the 1930s both composers were becoming tame and really not fulfilling their early huge expectation, which is, to me, is fascinating. I don't know whether that's a particularly Manchester comment, if you like, or whether it's one that is a view that was more widely held of those composers. But certainly it seems that it was the Second Viennese school who was still attracting the, you know, they were the real enfant terrible.
It was absolutely reflected in France. I mean, certainly by the 1930s, there's a sense in which Stravinsky was beginning to bore and disappoint, actually, and perhaps similar with Hindemith, but certainly it's a view that is absolutely rife in the continent too, with lots of debates in the press. Yeah. So fascinating issues. David Fligg has got his hand up, so I'm going to hand over to David.
Thank you, Harvey, for that. I didn't realise I had my hand up. I tried to, but it wasn't registering on my screen. So thanks for clocking that, Barbara. Harvey, quite clearly, Arnold Cook had so many British contemporaries, composers around him. And I'm just wondering to what extent he was sort of keyed into the British contemporary music scene. To what extent other composers, such as, for example, Vaughan Williams or William Walton or Britten and Tippett and others as well, were familiar with his music and championed his cause, so to speak?
Oh, that's an interesting question. As for those composers you're mentioning championing Arnold's music, I'm not sure that's quite the case. I mean, there are one or two interesting comments from Britain who certainly, well, let's say, tolerated his music. I don't know if he championed it. Walton, I don't know. I've never found any sort of connection at all with Walton. Certainly, Cook himself was hugely enthusiastic about all those composers' music, particularly Walton. And I think there's well, as Cook's music sort of matures during the 1940s and 50s, there is to be found a fairly healthy dose from time to time of Walton, particularly in the music of the early 50s. Vaughan Williams, I mean, there's a lovely comment by Cook that he found Vaughan Williams's music something like, it's so devastatingly tonal. And he sort of made comments about that sort of thing. I mean, I don't know if Vaughan Williams was particularly even aware of him. I suppose yes, he would have been actually. Of course, he would, because of the Contemporary Music Centre. And Cook was also, because he was a founder member of the Composers Guild in 1948, I think it was when it started. That meant that he would have come. Vaughan Williams would certainly have known him. So I don't know if that really answers your question. Quite how much cross-pollination from composer to composer, I'm not sure how much there was really.
If I could just follow that up, one of the things that I was thinking about and which interested me was that there are a number of emigre composers who arrived in this country either immediately after the Second World War or who managed to escape Hitler's occupied Europe before the war. And some of them, I'm thinking of Hans Gahl in particular, there was almost an unofficial blacklist against them, not because they were emigres or foreign or that they were Jewish, for example, but simply because they were encroaching on other people's territories. And the impression that I get sometimes is that there was sort of this sort of unofficial band, if you like, of composers in this country who were very careful who they sort of let into their circle.
Yeah, that's very interesting, isn't it? And in a way, although I think possibly Cook might have been seen that way to some extent, even though of course he was English, he was a Yorkshireman in fact, but because he'd studied with Hindemith and came back to this country with Walter Lee and Franz Reitzenstein, who I mentioned briefly, who was another one of those émigré composers. I think possibly he was bracketed in with them, and anyway, it's this. There's always been this view that Hindemith's music is somehow not wholesome, not just in this country but elsewhere as well. And for Cook, I think that was a real problem because he was massively influenced by him. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, so it's interesting. I think it's possibly one of the reasons for his current obscurity, actually. So thank you, David.
The next person is Jeff Thomason. Jeff?
There we are, just unmuting myself. Thanks, Harvey. Yeah, great. To a certain extent, Barbara's anticipated my question, but it's only one of several. Yes, Stravinsky did have quite a high profile in Manchester in the First World War, and not only was he being promoted by people like Beecham, but the press at the time is actually reporting that it's going down well. I mean, yes, occasionally there was a certain amount of bewilderment on the part of the press, but there again, I think you have to bear in mind that Samuel Langford is very much a sort of pre-war figure, whereas Cardus is a post-war figure, and there's a certain tension between the two. And Cardus, certainly in his early period, is determined to sort of show he is not Samuel Langford. But Langford was no great sort of champion of new music. One person who was, of course, was Robert Forbes, and you mentioned Robert Forbes. We have this idea that the Royal Manchester College of Music was a conservative institution, because latterly it did, and I think it was, and I think that did sort of nuance the way we look at it. But I think in the 30s it wasn't half as conservative as we think it was. Forbes was a great promoter. Even before he became principal, he was taking part in concerts of contemporary music, playing Prokofiev and Stravinsky as early as 1917. And the other big player, and you mentioned this in passing, is Albert Cross, who's running the Manchester School of Music. And yes, it was a private school, but it was doing great things in promoting contemporary music, because Cross was obsessed with promoting new music, often beyond the capacity of his students, but particularly new British music. And I'm trying to get to the bottom of this at the moment. It's what I'm currently working on. But the Manchester School of Music is actually a much bigger player than you might imagine in promoting contemporary music in Manchester at this time.
Yes, I mean, I thank you, Jeff, for that. I knew you would have a considerable number of enlightening comments to make on this period. I felt slightly as though I'm treading on your patch, so excuse me if I have. But I think you know, I'm fascinated by this business with Cardus, because on the one hand he writes that sort of excoriating review of Cook's first quartet, but in the same breath he's wanting, or virtually the same breath, the next breath he's asking composers to promote or promoters to program music that's more daring. So I mean, you know, which does he actually want? I think, you know, it's a fascinating world, and I totally agree with you about, as I alluded to in what I said sort of earlier, that I think by the 1930s, you know, people like Lucy Pearce are really playing vast amounts of contemporary music, absolutely vast amounts. Sorry, Jeff.
No, I was echoing. Yes, she was.
Yeah, I mean, really considerable.
If you look at the chamber concerts in the First World War, again, she's a name that crops up a lot of the time, and she's introducing a lot of French repertoire, for example, into Manchester.
Yeah, as indeed were other students. There was a Ravel specialist, as I'm sure you know, during the 1930s, as one of the students, another woman. And in fact, there were loads and loads of women active in promoting contemporary music. It's just a fascinating period, and seems to have, you know, despite the way we sort of think of the First World War as totally ending the 19th century, if you like, and its ways of thinking and so on. Actually, it seems to me that there were two strands still running parallel in the 30s: that which was moving towards the avant-garde and a new world, and that which was still sticking, if you like, to, well, essentially pre First World War.
And I think one of the fascinations of British music in the 30s is we were trying to synthesize the two. You know, it's a very British thing to want to try and find the happy medium between two extremes, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree more, really.
Great, thank you. Adam Swain would like to ask a question. Adam.
Yeah, Harvey, I loved it. Thank you ever so much. I always enjoy hearing more about Ardell Cook, a composer I don't know very much about, and I enjoyed it almost as much as your CDs of Ardell Cook, which I love even more. So thank you so much. And I was really delighted to get a shout out, although I did get slightly nervous when you said you were going to start ranting, but I don't think you ever rant. Although I did find it very interesting. I mean, we talked about Ferdinand Ries and how his reputation is sort of nailed to the soul of Beethoven. It sticks to him like some kind of ectoplasm. And I personally, I don't mind that, because it's a window for everyone to get involved with Ries's music. And I wonder if you feel the same way about Ardell Cook and Hindemith. I mean, is that relationship as student, teacher, mentor Is it helpful in the history of Cook, or is it unhelpful because Hindemith might seem to overshadow Cook's legacy?
Great question. Thank you, Adam. Well, I mean, the short answer to that is that I think it is a problem, because whereas Beethoven is universally accepted as a great genius and a wonderful composer, Hindemith is not. And I think that's problematic. And I think it's also, this is a major reason, as I was alluding to before, with, you know, why Cook is partly why he's so little known today. And it seems to me a nonsense, you know, that there are plenty of, how do you put it? I mean, this is why I started with this business about being. It makes me cross that artists are always mentioned in the context of another artist, or so often, you know, rather than being assessed just on simply their own merits. And that's the way I want to come at it. So yeah, I don't think it's particularly helpful in Cook's case. For Rees, perhaps it is, and I know exactly what you mean. But even so, people will tend to go, "Oh, Rees, very interesting," you know. But actually, we know what he did, and that connection with Beethoven's fab. But who knows his concertos and his? I mean, there is, what is it, 80 odd, 90 sonatas by Rees, instrumental sonatas. You know, they should be known. It's good stuff. There you are, championing Rees.
Well, one thing that is really striking is a couple of generations ago, or probably just a couple of decades ago, to work on a so-called second-rate composer would have, you couldn't do it for a doctorate. It wouldn't have been acceptable. And I know I had those difficulties with Mio, working on Mio. But I think there's been a change in attitude, a change that actually, if you just look at the greats, you're looking at a very skewed idea of our musical past, and that to look at some of those figures for whatever reason who've been forgotten and overlooked actually gives results in a richer understanding of our musical culture, the past. So it's interesting the work you're doing to address that.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a question from Jack Adler McKean.
Hi, thanks Barbara. Thanks Harvey, really fascinating talk. I just was thinking more, exploring a bit more this idea you thought of, maybe that Cook's reputation in this time, the 30s, came from his lack of willingness to engage in the avant-garde, not just the avant-garde in music, but also the political sort of wave of music making that was sweeping certain parts of Europe. It got me thinking that how well Hindemith taught in what was then the Hochschule für Musik in Berlin and is now the Universität der Kunst. He left, of course, to go to the US, and he never came back. He never lived in Germany again. Whereas his almost contemporary Hans Eisler, who is one of probably the most famous political composers, one could say, who very much wore his politics on his sleeve. He returned to Germany, to East Berlin after the war, and indeed the East German Music College is named after him. And so I just wondered if it's perhaps part of a broader theme of composers who are less willing to engage with the political surroundings, perhaps not having so much sort of experience or exposure, I mean, more than experience, to the musical community at large.
Interesting. Thanks very much. It's a really interesting question. And in Cook's case, he was he's interesting again for this reason, because whilst not necessarily particularly politically active, he was nonetheless very heavily associated in the late 30s and throughout the 40s with the British Communist Party, with Bush, and with Alan Bush, that is, of course, and also with people with, say, the poet Randall Swingler as well. And in fact, he contributed to the 1939 pageant for the people, which had an audience of many thousand in the Albert Hall, and it was absolutely a sort of communist piece, if you like. And he remained. Christian Darnton was another now rather obscure figure who was politically active and so on. And I mean, certainly still in the 1960s, letters I've found of Cook's, he's talking about the opportunity with the forthcoming general election to finally get rid of the Tories again. And gosh, yeah, I'm not going to start. You know, so he's associated with left-wing politics, both at least actively and certainly musically throughout the. But it was, you know, there was an enormous crowd of artists, as I'm sure you know, Jack, who were involved and at the very least sympathetic to that movement in
Sure.
the late 30s.
I just find it interesting that he chose. He seemed, as far as I'm no expert, but as far as I can tell, he explicitly chose not to incorporate those themes into his music so much. Just on that story of the 60s, and it just reminded me of a great interview I've read with Elliot Carter, who died just before the 2012 election, and he had some interesting stories to tell about that.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can entirely imagine. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Alan Bush is the most obvious example, really, of somebody who specifically,
Sure.
you know, in terms of English music, associated his music with the left. But I wonder if you know, word setting apart, one wonders how much by listening to, let's say, a string quartet or, you know, set of variations, how much you could say, my gosh, that's very communist sounding, isn't it?
Sure. I suppose I remember very clearly the first time I heard De Process from Eisler, and it was like a kind of slap in the face of socialist realism. There's no way of avoiding it. But yes, theatre is very different from concert music.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you.
Harvey, your comment, you know, the string quartet is communist or whatever, reminds me of a statement that Darius Milhaud made after World War II when he came back to France, where he said, well, how can a string quartet be communist or fascist? You know, how they precisely that issue about the alignment of politics in non-theatrical music. You're absolutely right that if you set Esther de Carpentras, or if you set very clearly theatre pieces, it's another question. But it just made me smile at your comment. I'll send you that thing from Mio. Okay. Mark Dyer. Mark's got the next question. Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Harvey, for your talk and some very juicy reviews there. Good God. So I'm interested in the comment you made about the Manchester New Music Centre and about how they were playing repertoire that was sort of, you know, 15 years old. It got me thinking about how problematic terms like contemporary music and new music are still today, where we, you know, even composers today struggle to really define those terms, and we still talk about sort of mid-century repertoire within those brackets. I just wonder if you'd be able to, or if you know kind of what was generally conceived of at that time as contemporary or new music, and especially with regards to that Manchester Centre, you know, even though that music was 15 years old, did they still really view that as being contemporary and new to them, I guess?
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, thank you, Mark. I mean, it's a great question. It's quite difficult to know because there are so many strands, if you like, to the if you like, the crowd of consumers, because there are, as there always are at any point in history, if you like. I think that certainly, as I was saying before, the second Viennese school was still considered very much modern, if you like, and I think, and Bartók also, I might say, his music is not played that often, from what I've found anyway, at the Contemporary Music Centre. And yet, you know, he's a composer who is, well, he's only got 10 more years to live at that point in time. It's 1935, you know, so yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, certainly, I think they felt that there's a duality, really, because on the one hand, when contemporary British music is played, the reviewers complain that the music doesn't feel contemporary, or doesn't sound contemporary, if you like, which I always think is a strange concept anyway. I mean, music that's written today is contemporary whenever you happen to be hearing it. It doesn't matter what it sounds like. Whether it's constantly challenging you is quite another matter. And I think they were, they were struggling, quite frankly, in the 1930s in Britain, as I think we still struggle with that sort of thing. It's just a really tricky question to answer, and then it brings into, if you talk to audiences today, it's still a problem. In my experience, regular concert-going audiences will, on average, I would say probably the majority of them still find it difficult listening to Hindemith, Bartók, whatever. They will still be challenged by that, and it's hardly new. So I just don't think it's changed much, to be absolutely honest.
I wonder if there's an argument to say about, regardless of when it is composed, if there's an element of being challenged by it, if that is a kind of a partial criterion for new music, or contemporary, or something like that. I don't know. That seems to be a facet not to be ignored.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, you could listen to some of the, let's say, late Mozart, some of the Masonic music. That's without doubt challenging. You listen to lots and lots of Beethoven, obviously the late stuff. It still sounds challenging. It's still, in a sense, modern, isn't it? You listen to late Haydn, it was modern for its time. There's no question of that, right up to date. And as for Berlioz, I mean, they must have wondered what on earth he was doing at some points. I mean, I confess I still find Berlioz quite challenging at times. And so, yeah, I think that's very much the case. And Cook has certainly, his reputation has suffered because he wasn't writing music at the at the cutting edge, if you like, of modern technology. I mean, he said in the 60s or 70s, actually early 70s, he said, I haven't tried most or many contemporary techniques. I've occasionally formed some of my material from using serial techniques and 12 tone tonality, but I use it in the formation of material rather than a strictly serial composition. He basically couldn't really. I don't think he really understood it, and it didn't appeal. So that's that, I think.
Great. Thanks, Harvey.
It's a huge topic, this whole issue of what we mean by contemporary, and it's one that has preoccupied generations of musicians. But thinking about the Contemporary Music Centre, the London Contemporary Music Centre was the British section of the International Society for Contemporary Music. So I'd be quite interested to know where Manchester fitted in that. And I'm looking at the French section, and I'm making comparisons between the British and the French. But even the questions about what they mean about contemporary music, or the music that represents that country, and taking it to these international contemporary music chamber music festivals is a really controversial and often contentious issue. And it's interesting to see how that definition of whether they need to be really pushing the edges of difficulty, whether that is a relevant thing, is something that's very evident from the international contemporary music programs. So I think this is a really pertinent question for that period. Of course, it remains a question now.
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of, as far as the English were concerned, with Edward Dent sitting on the RNCM panel, right? Well, he was there at the inception of it, I think, wasn't he? Actually, I mean, the thing is, by the 1940s, I think it is, for the or late 30s, I think. Sorry, for the actual society's festivals, as you're talking about, he's complaining that, well, it's all going to be sewn up because of von Webern sitting on the the panel with Dent, and that therefore all this Middle European serial music gets heard, and nothing of the stuff that our wonderful British composers or little of it, is very difficult to get it heard. So even Dent's complaining of that, and he's sitting on the panel himself. So it's an interesting one.
Yes, but he was also quite anti-German, which is good. Comes out in quite a number of his commentaries. But yes, absolutely. We've got a number of comments that are coming up in the chat, and I thought we could look at these quite. Let's go through them. Let's not talk about the hens and the cats and the hennar, but moving on. Noah's flood. Okay. But there was something interesting about George Nicholson. So Alan Bush, okay. And that's from Jane. Settings by George Nicholson of William Morris. Okay, so we've got that. That's Jane singing a concert organised by Alan Bush.
Right.
And then Jack Adlam McCain's comment about Woody Allen on Wagner, who wants to remind us. Not sure you do, maybe.
I thought everyone knew this story. Woody Allen talking about composers' political affiliations in music. And Woody Allen, when interviewed about the controversy of performing Wagner in Israel and all these issues, he famously replied saying that every time I hear Wagner, I just get this irresistible urge to invade Poland.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's the issue of Wagner is a wonderfully contentious one. So who we are, the former student Dominic Dola, I remember him. Okay, absolutely, that's really interesting. From David Horn, he's doing a PhD on Bush in South Africa. Interesting student.
Yes, I've been in touch with Dominic actually recently. He very. In fact, he's just had some of my CDs sent over because he's interested, because the whole period is links together for him too. So our research definitely overlaps.
Great, and then Joanna Bullivant, who's done work in this general area. Who's this? Adam Swain. Adam Swain likes Hindemith, the Wind Symphony in B flat. I think sometimes people have heard too many Hindemith sonatas performed by not the fabulous students of our institution, but perhaps in other places, and it puts some people off. But you're right to recognise him. And Anna Wright, Jack, about tuba players wanting new music to play. Yeah, these are very vague categories, aren't they? Entry for trumpet mentioned unaccompanied repertory by 6 contemporary composers, none of them still alive. That's yeah, that's very telling things. But I come across that a lot with Debussy, certainly, that when he was dead, who's still being regarded as a contemporary composer. I'm sure that still happens. David Horn, sonatas, trumpet, harp, second piano. Okay, so we've got 2 more supporters. Adam Swain again. We've got fans of Gesualdo as well, but difficulty. So I don't know if you can see these so David Horn, Music is lovely.
Yeah, I mean the massive variety of Hindemith's output. I mean, he really did write a vast amount of music, and the majority of it is really not played today. But that perhaps the most approachable of, well, there's a lot of it that's approachable, and he was his style was enormously varied as well. I mean, the stuff he was writing in the 1920s is absolutely nothing like the stuff in the 1930s. And then again, and he sort of then goes back to a more challenging style, I suppose, by the mid-1950s. Again, I mean, the Tuba Sonata, Jack, which I'm sure you know inside out, is a particularly good example of a really complex and it's bloody hard to play as well for the piano anyway. Piece of music by Hindemith. So, yeah. Really, there's much more exploration in my book. But then I'm a fan.
So that question that we had earlier about the problem of association of Cook with Hindemith, that it has damaged, it's been damaging for his reputation rather than being seen as in the coattails of Beethoven, in the other example of Ries. So maybe you need to, or people need to, rehabilitate Hindemith, because we've got lots of fans in this Zoom forum. So maybe that if you could rehabilitate Hindemith, then Cook might have a better chance of being appreciated. Any thoughts?
Totally agree.
Okay.
I basically, I've thought it countless times myself. I mean, I just don't really understand it. When you have a voice as original as that in the plethora of strands of amazing music that the 20th century produced, I find it very odd that one of them should simply be, if you like, just, well, cut out for no particularly good reason that I can understand. But
well, it's there was a sort of orthodoxy, wasn't there? I mean, it's the way in which the 20th century has been shaped and understood. It's at the heart of it. But there's a massive rethinking of that now. And Jeff's comment about the fetishization of innovation, that is sort of being challenged, I would suggest. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts. Okay, Anna would like to come in.
Yes, I wanted to ask who Cook's best known pupils are, and did they suffered by association going down that next generation?
Thanks, Anna. That's a good question, actually. The answer is to who his pupils were. Well, he taught at Trinity for a really long time, 30 years actually, the 5 in Manchester. But an awful lot of what he was doing there was not particularly teaching composition. I mean, he did have composition students, but I'd have to say that most of them are not particularly well known. One of those who's made a big name for himself, but again, not particularly in the field of classical music, is Olatunde Akin Euba, who is an African composer, now a very elderly one as well. I think he's nearly 90 himself, who's done a lot in terms of bringing well, I don't like this word particularly, but crossover music, if you like, concert music and African music together, and trying to make sense of, trying to bring African traditional music to wider knowledge, I think, in the West. That's partly what he's done. What's his name? Senator Ronald Senator was one of his students, who's one of the better known ones, who's no longer alive. But no, is the answer in short to your question. So.
That's a very interesting comment from Peggy Nolan. So Louise Lansdowne's Hindemith elective at the RNCM in around 2010 was a wonderful introduction to so much of this rep. Many of us string students at the time discovered a lot of his chamber music through the project she arranged. Peggy, I should have got you to say it rather than reading it out, but I think that's a very interesting comment. So maybe we need an elective on Hindemith and Cook. That's one that will Harvey can teach for us. Mark Dyer says, jumping on the Hindemith fan wagon. Okay, the Triadische, yep, okay. I don't, do you know that? We've got the Achstücke.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe we need to have a Hindemith event, Hindemith and Contemporaries, or Hindemith and Forgotten Contemporaries, or maybe some sort of festival stroke conference on forgotten, maligned composers, neglected composers. I'm sure they have happened before, but maybe we need to do something. So that's a challenge for you, Harvey, and everyone else who's obviously very keen, and certainly on Hindemith.
No problem.
We haven't heard you play.
No, I was going to. Do you know? I was going to play. I was going to play one of the short, the 3 pieces from three piano pieces from 1935 to give a flavour of the music of that period. But I was warned that my presentation shouldn't be too long, and in the event, I decided against.
You don't want to finish this lovely forum with some performance, some playing, or you're in the wrong room?
I'm A, in the wrong room, and B, I haven't actually, I mean, I haven't practiced it, to be perfectly honest, now that I've decided not to do it, and it's rather tricky. But I could give you a quick, no, that's a bit rash.
Well, maybe we need to have another event where you play to us, because that would have been rather wonderful. I think Adam's comment that the CDs of the music are even more wonderful than this. So, but it's fantastic that you're able to put that expertise, performance, a study of the sources, and also your detailed knowledge of Cook, bring that all together in this way, and it's perfect for a conservatoire. So really delighted for that. So we've got some more comments. Yes, we've got more of them fan singing the praises of Hindemith. So I think maybe we need to do something on Hindemith next year. So if we have any volunteers, we can perhaps organise a research forum that involves Hindemith and maybe some others. Okay. And then Michelle says we could all sing it. Okay. Right. Any more final comments? I think there's a very rich presentation, Harvey, and it touches on many of our particular interests, and it shows that there are so many connections between the sort of things that we're all interested in doing, and the things that are preoccupying us musically on a daily basis, or at least when we're not in meetings and given the chance to think. And it's wonderful that you're doing this rather fundamental work on a composer who has been unjustly neglected. Really interesting discussion, and this is our last session. It's been a fabulous term, actually. We weren't going to have many research forum seminars at all. We were just going to have sort of special occasions, but the pandemic gave us the challenge, really, of saying, well, why not do them? Because actually bringing us all together once a week, we can't go to the bar, but at least we can chat to each other, is a really fruitful thing to do. We are going to be in the autumn term starting online, or the research forum will remain online, but we can show it can happen really well. So we are looking for ideas, suggestions of, if you would like to give a presentation, please let Tom know, Tom Wise, maybe copy me in, or copy one of us in the research office. We will do our very best to incorporate that. If you can see how things might come together, I really like the idea of colleagues who do slightly different things or look at things in different ways coming together on a topic or on an issue. That's another thing we could think about doing. Next term, we're going to be inviting external speakers. So we're very interested in your suggestions for external speakers. And we want to reflect the absolute range of our research expertise in the college. And that's an expertise that is growing all the time, and certainly there's amazing musical knowledge and expertise at the RNCM. So please, think of people you would like us to invite. They will present and we'll make them part of our community, and that will be a new step. If you can think of ways in which we can make our people who are listening on YouTube feel more part of it, then we're really looking forward to that. So before we lose all the wonderful comments, or if somebody can save them perhaps, Adam's being very, let's see. Yes, excellent research forums. Love these Wednesday slots, and especially love this one. Thank you, Harvey. That's lovely. David Horn, it's an opportunity perhaps for speakers who otherwise couldn't be in the UK. I think that's amazing. That's absolutely true. We often can't afford to bring people over, certainly from very far. And sometimes we pinch them if they're in somewhere near on the continent. We can nip them over cheaply. But the days of a cheap airline flights are probably gone now. So yes, let's take advantage of that. If you you have people in far-flung parts of the world, we would love to see that. We're also very interested in looking at the issues that have come up with Black Lives Matter, and we would like to have some thought about equality and diversity in the topics and in the people that we invite to our research forum. So please, can we have ideas for suggested speakers, presenters? They're welcome to perform over Zoom if they want to as well. David Horn says he's certainly got some ideas on that, so thank you for that. We've greetings from Sicily, from Davide. One of the beauties has been to make colleagues, and our doctoral students are our colleagues in that sense, make them feel that they're part of a community. It doesn't matter where you are. So let's take advantage of that opportunity. We like the idea that our forum sessions are not just for us, they're also for a wider public, and people do actually listen to them and watch them later on. They're probably amused by some of the technical hiccups that we've had from time to time, but I'm sure people are understanding. Great, so please, if you can, Jack's got an interesting idea. If you can send ideas to David, to Tom Wise, copy me in, and we'll have a great program next term, okay? Meanwhile, I hope you get some rest and that your life is not entirely on Zoom. And I hope that you're not always working and can put your feet up, and wishing you well and health over the next few months, and see you back in the autumn. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you, Harvey. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, as well. Much appreciated. And thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.